Hi, I'm David Shipler.
And I'm Daniel Zwerdling.
Two reporters start now. Hi, Danny. How you doing?
Great, thanks. And here's our mission today. We're going to find out, why would anybody confess to police that they murdered somebody when the fact is they're totally innocent?
And false confessions are not a small problem. If you look at people who've been freed from prison after DNA has showed that they are actually innocent, it turns out that roughly 20% of them originally confessed that they had committed the crime. That shocking figure comes from the Innocence Project.
Yeah, remember the case of the Central Park Five? I remember this like it was just a few years ago. But back in 1989, the police arrested 5 teenagers for beating up and raping a woman in Central Park in New York and leaving her for dead. And they went to prison for up to 13 years.
New York's mayor at the time, New York City's mayor, called it the crime of the century, the brutal rape and beating of a woman who was jogging in Central Park back in 1989. The victim was a 28-year-old investment banker, and her courageous battle for survival made front-page news around the world. Also making headlines, the suspects in the case, 5 Black and Latino teenagers who were eventually convicted, even though none of them did it. Police got them to confess after turning them against each other during hours of interrogations.
In fact, their confessions didn't even coincide with each other in terms of location and supposed time of the crime and other details. There was no forensic evidence, such as fingerprints or DNA, and eventually they were all exonerated.
Well, our guest today has worked most of his life trying to help judges and juries understand why defendants like the Central Park Five give false confessions. Alan Hirsch, welcome.
Glad to be here.
You used to run the Justice and Law Studies program at Williams College, and you have taught there.
And now Alan testifies as an expert witness on false confessions in trials across the country.
And here's another important credential. You helped Dave on his terrific book, Rights at Risk, right? Did he quote you accurately? I hope.
Perfectly.
Yeah, Alan, you were really very helpful. Your insights, let me summarize them from the first couple of paragraphs of my chapter on false confessions, because I think it sets the stage for our discussion pretty well. If you've never been tortured or even locked up and verbally threatened, you may find it hard to believe that anyone would admit to a crime that he didn't commit. Intuition holds that the innocent do not confess. What on earth could be the motive? To stop the abuse? To curry favor with the interrogator? To follow some fragile thread of imaginary hope that cooperation will bring freedom? Yes, all of the above. In desperate helplessness, for short-term gain without regard for long-term consequences, the suspect simply concedes or comes to accept in more complex fashion his own fabrications of guilt. And that's something that is really difficult for most people to understand.
Yes. To begin with, there are a lot of reasons, many of which you touched on, why an innocent person would confess, starting with a desire for notoriety. And we find false confessions in many, if not most, high-profile cases. The Lindbergh baby's kidnapping gave rise to more than 200 false confessions.
Back in the 1930s, let's just remind people, Charles Lindbergh, the famous aviator, his baby was kidnapped.
And some decades later, a single man in Texas confessed to more than 600 homicides. And the FBI and Texas Rangers actually believed him and considered those homicides solved. It turns out that he probably killed his mother, the crime for which he was in prison, and that was the only crime he ever committed. But the biggest cause, or at least the most concerning cause, are certain police interrogation tactics, very widespread, which lead people to believe, innocent as well as guilty people, that the best or only way to escape from a desperate situation is essentially to tell the police what they want to hear, which is that you committed the crime. And also, these same interrogation tactics lead some people to actually believe they did commit the crime, what we call an internalized false confession. But in a nutshell, prisons are full of innocent people. And that is not an exaggeration.
I want to ask you about statistics because I can't find very good ones on how many people have gone to prison, at least in part because they falsely confessed. Dave mentioned the Innocence Project figure based on their own data. There's the University of Michigan National Registry of Exonerations. They report that 12% of 2,500 felons in their database who got exonerated had given false confessions.
Okay, so we start with the fact that we have uncovered into the thousands cases of proven false confessions. And then there are many reasons why we know that these are just the tip of the iceberg.
But then you might mention also that DNA is not available in every case and hasn't been available forever. So there are lots of cases where people may have falsely confessed that, their innocence can't be demonstrated, right?
And David, you just stated one of those reasons, which is most of the false confessions that are uncovered are through DNA or other scientific methods, which are simply not available in most cases. But also, most of the criminal justice system takes place under the radar. That is to say, more than 90% of cases are resolved by guilty pleas.
Oh.
And this is both state and federal. We know for a fact that some guilty pleas are essentially false confessions. But once someone has pled guilty, there's usually no motivation or mechanism for anyone to get to the truth of the matter.
So the guilty plea can't be rescinded usually, is that right?
It's very, very difficult. And the person who's pled guilty usually isn't motivated to even try. The very reason he's pled guilty is because he's given up. He's decided he's better off serving his sentence and not contesting his guilt.
Because he might get a longer sentence if he goes to trial and is found guilty.
Exactly.
You said a moment ago that the prisons are filled with people who have falsely confessed. So if we don't have good statistics, give me your best estimate based on your years and years of work on this.
I can't do that. It's problematic. Prosecutors will try to pin me down on that. The data is simply not available. The government doesn't keep that data. We don't know how many confessions there are, much less how many are true or false. And most of the time, we won't find out whether they're true or false. So again, the one thing we know is that a staggering number of false confessions have been identified, have been proven. And then I was starting to give you the basis for knowing that that's just a sliver of actual false confessions. And I've given you some of the reasons. But another one is that the leading method of interrogation, we know, contributes to false confessions. There's an extensive literature on this, and we just see it in many analyses of actual false confessions.
And there are private companies that train police in how to do this.
And most police use this method, whether they are formally trained in it, whether they just pick it up in the air because that's how their partners are interrogating people. And I just see it over and over again. I mean, I've analyzed many, many hundreds of interrogations, and some version of this method is used an overwhelming percentage of the time. And we know this method produces false confessions. One other data point out there, which is really interesting, is in a self-report study of 600 professional investigators themselves in North America and also some in Canada.
These are police investigators.
Police investigators. These are people who are motivated to believe that they're getting at the truth. They estimated that roughly 5% of innocent suspects confess.
Well, what's the method, Alan? Can you describe it?
So the leading method of interrogation operates on two parts, confrontation and minimization. And they converge on the principle that if you convince someone he's better off confessing, he will confess. Common sense, right? So what they do, the investigators or the interrogators confront the suspect with evidence and certainty of his guilt. They basically say to them, we know you did it. There's no question about it. You will not be able to convince us or anyone else otherwise. They cut off the attempt to explain what really happened, and they make clear that it is futile for the suspect to maintain his innocence. That's what we call confrontation. They also suggest that the consequences of trying to maintain your innocence are severe. At the same time, or either simultaneously or subsequently, they minimize the crime or the suspect's involvement in it or culpability. So they may suggest that the suspect played only a secondary role, or was provoked, or had justification for any of a number of other reasons, or alcohol or drugs or a bad upbringing played a role, they communicate to them that the consequences won't be that severe, the punishment won't be that extreme, if only the suspect confesses. So, for example, we'll often hear them saying things like, "We want you to put this behind you and get on with your life." Now, that's not saying in so many words you're not going to prison if you confess, but it's a pretty reasonable inference. If you're going to move on, get on with your life, that doesn't sound like, well, you're going to be behind bars for the next 40 years.
There are legal limits, right, to what the police can promise. Can you explain them? I mean, they can go to some extent, but not to an extent that says explicitly you're going to get off, correct?
Right. To oversimplify, they are warned by the courts that they should not make explicit threats or promises. So they should not say, if you don't confess, you are going to prison for the rest of your life. And they should not say, if you do confess, you're going home today for good. But short of that, they can get away with an awful lot in terms of leading the suspect to draw those conclusions.
And what kinds of suspects tend to draw those conclusions? Are there particular characteristics of somebody who might be inclined or lean in that direction, Alan?
So two-part answers. There are certain groups that are clearly overrepresented in the population of false confessors. Those are juveniles, those are people who have mental illness, and those are people who have cognitive disabilities, what used to be called mental retardation, but basically they have a low IQ, let's say.
In fact, I saw a statistic, I think by the University of Michigan National Registry, that the majority of people in their database who gave false confessions were one of those, underage or mental disability or mental health issues.
Gentlemen, it is true that roughly 2/3 of false confessors fall into one of those three categories. But that leaves 1/3. And one of the lessons I have learned from my 2 decades in the field is anyone is capable of giving a false confession. You and I and the people you think of as the most stable, the most educated, the most normal. And one way for me to help you realize it's one way I realized it myself. Sleep deprivation plays a role in some cases of proven false confessions.
Sleep deprivation.
Try to imagine a time where you were desperate to go to sleep. You were so tired you simply couldn't keep your eyes open. Now, number one, that's going to cloud your judgment. And the pressures that are put on people in the interrogation room and the kind of desperation they can be made to feel, partly by circumstances and partly by the police leaning into their vulnerability, is so potent that I want to emphasize the 1/3 of false confessors who do not suffer from mental or emotional or psychological difficulties and are not young. They are just overwhelmed. And again, that can happen to anybody. And that does happen to, again, that's roughly 1/3 of the cohort.
And the interrogations can go on for many hours, right?
Absolutely. Sometimes days.
So let's go back to the first thing that you mentioned about confrontation and find out what case law, what the courts permit police to do and what they don't permit police to do. And police can lie in certain respects, right?
Remarkable. The United States Supreme Court has said that lying is not a grounds by itself for suppressing a confession. In other words, the police telling someone, there's an eyewitness that says you did it. There's DNA that proves you did it. This happens all the time. I should have mentioned that in connection with confrontation, that as part of convincing the suspect that they know he did it and he'll never convince anyone otherwise, the police confront him with evidence, often exaggerated or fabricated. And that, under the law, is not grounds for suppressing a confession, for keeping it out of evidence.
In other words, I as the police interrogator can say, look, we know you did it. We've already gotten a blood sample and the lab says it's yours.
They say it all the time. And to be clear, the Supreme Court has said that that can be part of the totality of the circumstances justifying suppression of a confession. In the real world, a relatively small percentage of confessions are suppressed. And the scandal is what's legal. The scandal is the kind of behavior that law enforcement gets away with that the courts say is okay.
Now, what are the limits of lying? So, for example, if a police officer waves a piece of paper and says, this shows that your DNA was at the crime scene or on the victim's body, can they actually fabricate that report in print, or are they restricted to just waving the paper and asserting that they have the results?
David, I was involved in a case where the law enforcement fabricated physically a lab report.
Really?
They created the lab report and they showed it to the defendant, the suspect, and this helped convince him that he must have committed the crime, an internalized false confession. Now, it turns out that under Kentucky law, it is a felony to do what they did. And the court said, well, yeah, that's a felony, but that doesn't invalidate the confession that resulted from that felony.
My heavens.
That was actually overturned on appeal. A lot of the criminal justice system is decentralized. It takes place in 50 states. They have their own laws. And even within their own state, judges have a great deal of discretion to make these kinds of decisions on what evidence is allowed and what isn't. So you will find the most egregious kinds of lying and other things. And then there are courts that will draw the line somewhat arbitrarily and say that went too far.
Now, the confession is a very powerful instrument in court, isn't it? I mean, it's really hard for a judge or a jury, for that matter, to regard it as false and ignore it. There's something psychological about that.
Yeah, and we know this. There's data that proves this.
Can you describe that data? I've wondered, studies of juries after convictions.
Yes, so these are cases which study proven false confessions. We eventually know the confession was false, typically from DNA, but it may be some other means. And in those cases that went to trial, 2 different studies, pretty consistent. In the neighborhood of 75% of those cases, the person was convicted. Now, think about this. These are cases where the confession is the primary piece of evidence. How do we know that? Well, the person is innocent.
So there's no real lab evidence.
There's certainly no legitimate smoking gun.
We were hoping to have somebody whose case you got involved in, who confessed to murdering his parents in the 1990s. He went to prison for 17 years. He's out now. It was proved beyond any doubt that he didn't have anything to do with the murder. And but now he's a lawyer, and he's representing people who've been wrongly convicted. He was going to join us today, but a court hearing came up, and he couldn't do it. We hope we'll get him perhaps in the next month or two. But we do have some excerpts from some actual police interrogations of another case you were involved with. But first, let's go back in history to find out how we got to this point. I read surprising facts about judges in the South back in the Civil War days, and judges in the South in slave times were warning about getting slaves and former slaves to give false confessions.
Yes, this is something I've written about. It's a weird historical fact that judges in general seem to be more sensitive to the possibility of false confessions in the 19th century than they were in the 20th and 21st centuries. And in the context of slavery, there was an understanding that people might be forced to confess falsely by their master, often beaten. And I think that bled over into the regular court system. And there was a recognition that people can confess falsely. And one of the things I've tried to show in my own writing is that the circumstances of the suspect under modern interrogation tactics is not that far from that of a slave. That is, they're under the control of an authority figure, often wielding a gun, typically in a small windowless room. And that authority figure has complete dominion over them effectively. And they can be made to feel inferior, desperate, weak, super vulnerable. So in my mind, the analogy to slavery should help us understand just how abusive modern interrogation practice is.
There's an 1897 case in the Supreme Court, Bram versus United States, is that right?
Yes.
And they quoted a textbook's warning that a confession, quote, must not be extracted by any sort of threats or violence, nor obtained by any direct or implied promises, however slight.
It's a remarkably enlightened opinion, and oddly, it is still technically what lawyers call good law. It's never been overruled, but it has been ignored and evaded and circumvented. All we would need to do is take that opinion seriously, and we would take a major step forward in reducing the problem of false confessions. But sadly, that opinion it's a great opinion, and it's still good law, and it's all but useless.
But then, in 1966, the Supreme Court ruled in the Miranda case that a defendant has the right to silence and to an attorney. It was a narrow decision, by the way. It's often forgotten. I think it was 5-4. It was not unanimous, that's for sure.
And please remind everybody what the Miranda warning is all about.
So the Miranda warnings are, as people know who watch the cop shows,
you're under arrest.
You have the right to remain silent. You have the right to an attorney. Anything you do say may be used against you in a court of law.
A little known fact about Miranda is that it was in large part in response to this widespread interrogation tactic that I was talking about. So if we just dip back, until the 1930s, police literally beat confessions out of people. Or they shined bright lights in their eyes, the old third degree, pounded tables, they did all this violent stuff. And courts began to frown upon that, and not just courts, society began to frown upon that. And what emerged in this vacuum were these psychological tactics to replace the physical tactics for making people confess.
And as you've said, a lot of police departments hire a specific company to teach their officers how to do that.
The first manual of which was put forth in 1962. It's no coincidence that just 4 years later, the Supreme Court is authoring the Miranda opinion and explicitly stating that these warnings are necessary to safeguard against these new and rapidly widespread interrogation tactics.
But that didn't seem to make a lot of difference, did it, Alan? I mean, you know, post-1966, there were still a lot of false confessions. And, you know, how does that work? I mean, why? Why is that? You'd think that if a defendant is properly warned, that he or she would say, well, I want an attorney. I'm not going to talk to you until I get one.
Now, to the question why it didn't do much good, to oversimplify, I think there's a two-part answer. One is police are pretty skilled at giving the warnings in a perfunctory or misleading manner. It is presented to the suspect, basically, this is some paperwork, we just have to get out of the way.
Yeah, they want you to sign something, and, oh, by the way, incidentally, you can have a lawyer. You don't have to.
Yeah, that's what it is. And secondly, the intuition that innocent people have nothing to hide is widely true. It's widely accepted by innocent people themselves. So the innocent person is likely to think, why do I need to stay silent? Why do I need the lawyer?
Yeah, I can persuade the police that I'm innocent, right?
Exactly. And so for both of those reasons, Miranda has been a largely unfulfilled promise.
Just a reminder to everyone, we're talking with Alan Hirsch, an expert on false confessions, formerly a professor at Williams College.
Alan, let's move to a case that you were involved with fairly recently, in just the last handful of years. This was the case of Brooke Skylar Richardson, a high school student in Carlisle, Ohio.
Now to new bombshell developments in the trial of the woman accused of killing and burying her newborn. Prosecutors played the video of the police interrogation of Skylar Richardson before she was arrested. Mike Schell is live in Lebanon covering
her
trial.
You got a call from some lawyers in Ohio. Tell us what happened.
Well, they told me they had an amazing case on their hands. They had a client, a teenage girl, who was pregnant for 32 weeks without her or anyone else knowing about it. And then during a visit to her OBGYN to obtain birth control, it was discovered that she was pregnant.
She had an eating disorder as it unfolded, and even her friends didn't realize that she was gaining weight, and she fit into her prom dress just a couple days before she gave birth.
Her friends didn't know it, her parents didn't know it, and again, even into the third trimester, Skylar herself didn't know it. And then it only became known 10 weeks later when she returns to the OBGYN, not for anything having to do with the pregnancy, And they see in her file, it's a different physician who examines her, but sees in her file that she was pregnant and says, well, what happened to the baby? And Skylar says, a few weeks ago, it was stillborn, and I buried it in my backyard. The physician calls the police, and police go to Skylar's house, get permission from her parents to take her to the station to interview her, telling them she's in no trouble, we just have to talk to her about something. And they take Skylar to the station, and they ask her about what happened.
And we have some excerpts of that police interview. Actually, interviews. They meet with Skylar twice. And listeners, you're going to find that this audio is really hard to understand, which actually makes me wonder, why don't police use better recording equipment? And anyway, Dave and I will also read what they say from the transcript.
Things will be okay. I don't have to go to jail. You're not going to jail. Okay? We're not taking you to jail today. You're not going to jail, okay?
In case you're having trouble understanding that, Skylar is asking, panicked, am I going to jail? And the policewoman is reassuring her, you're not going to jail, okay? We're not taking you to jail today. You're not going to jail, okay? We just want to get some things straightened up so we can figure out exactly what happened.
Some things straightened up so that we can figure out exactly what happened. Are you being 100% honest with us here? Okay. All right. Just deep breaths, okay? I know this has to have been really hard on you. I'm sure there's part of you that is glad that...
The policewoman continues, all right, just deep breaths, okay? I know this has been really hard on you. And Skylar says, I just want everybody to believe me because I don't want to be in trouble. And the policewoman says, I understand. You're a very nice young lady. I know that you're smart. I know that you're honest.
I know that you're honest. I know you have a big heart.
I know you have a big heart, okay? I believe that. I don't think you're a bad person, okay? We're not judging you. We just have to get facts.
I don't think you're a bad person, okay? Just like you said, we're not judging you. We just have to get facts, okay? Things are going to get better from here, okay?
So, a couple things about that. That is classic textbook minimization.
Minimization.
Yes, we see this. This happens literally every day. Minimization.
Minimizing the severity of the guilt, of the culpability of the defendant.
Right, exactly.
It'll be okay, though, right? They'll be okay. So don't worry about that. Nobody hates you. We don't hate you, okay? Nobody's going to hate you, okay? We understand that you went through some really bad stuff and it was really hard on you, okay? And now you got some people to turn to, okay?
Suggesting that the consequences of confession will not be severe. At one point they say to her, it's not like we're going to jump up and down and say you're going to jail, from which she might readily conclude she's not going to jail if she confesses.
But that doesn't go too far in terms of case law and what the police are permitted to do?
Not according to the courts.
Well, then the police turn up the pressure, especially in the second interview. Skylar keeps telling them that she was sitting on the toilet and the baby gushed out and the baby seemed dead right from the beginning. But the police gradually keep insisting, they do it in a civil way, but they keep insisting that, no, the baby must have been alive.
And again, I don't expect you to know exactly, but how long do you think that she was alive? Like just your
The policeman is saying, I don't expect you to know exactly, but how long do you think that she was alive? Like just your closest guess. I mean, I know you're not sure how long she was in the toilet, but how long would be your closest guess? How long was she alive?
We have an idea of how long she was alive. Do we think it was 2 minutes? Do we think it was 5 minutes? Do we think it was 10 minutes?
Do we think it was 2 minutes? Do we think it was 5 minutes? Do we think it was 10 minutes? You know, it doesn't change things if it was 5 minutes or 10 minutes or 20 minutes or 30 minutes.
Now, this is after Skylar has over and over and over said the baby was never alive. So this is a classic, when did you stop beating your wife question.
Yeah, so they planted that idea with her.
Absolutely. And we talked about the permissibility of lying. This interrogation was really one big lie. Because as you say, they led Skylar to believe they were there to help her. They were her friends. And something I don't believe I've ever seen, the woman detective actually is holding her hand for much of the interrogation.
Yes, in fact, at one point you hear Skylar say, "Can I hold your hand?"
Yeah. This is right. So again, the analogy to slavery, this poor kid just doesn't know that for the cops, this is all role playing. And I just want to mention one other thing they said. They told her at different points that the purpose of this inquiry was to get a proper burial for the baby. and obviously another very deceptive suggestion. This is all designed to achieve one purpose, and that is to get her to say she killed her baby. And they somewhat, maybe predictably, break Skylar down into confessing that the child was born alive and she killed it, drowned it in her toilet.
And then the police give Skylar some shocking news. The forensic pathologist says that after they dug up her baby's body in her backyard, the exam showed that parts of the baby had been burned.
Tell me about the fire. What fire?
The policewoman's saying, "Tell me about the fire." And Skylar looks up and says, "What fire?"
I didn't burn her. Are you sure? I swear on anything.
You sure?
That I'm sure of. I'm sure of.
And the police go on to say, I'm quoting here, "There is forensic medical evidence. There are some different vertebrae and some ribs and stuff that are charred. And then there was some fatty tissue that's burned on one side and not the other. So the doctors know there was a fire of some sort, some kind of burning. They know for certain."
So we have to think about maybe you were out of your mind.
Maybe you were out of your mind. I don't know. Something happened, but there was something with a fire.
And she looks completely flabbergasted to being told she burned the child. But before long, she's telling them that, yes, I did that too. They break her down, essentially, and she confesses not only to killing the child, but to burning it. I've given you the Reader's Digest version of what happened, but I looked at these interrogations and I was able to pass along to Skylar's attorney that I found the interrogation that broke her down was extremely troubling.
And of course, later, the forensic pathologist who had said, oh, yes, the baby was partially burned, recanted and said, you know what? I'm sorry, I was wrong. There's no evidence of burning.
Right. The baby wasn't burned. And yes, so they conclude beyond doubt that the baby was not burned. And now you have Skylar confessing not only to killing the baby, but to burning it. So we know that a central part of her confession was false. That's obviously a crucial datum that at a minimum should have made them highly suspicious about her confession to killing the baby.
So then what was the outcome? What happened to Brooke Skylar Richardson in the end?
Defendant, please rise. Count one, we, the jury in the above captioned case, find the defendant, Brooke Skylar Richardson, not guilty of the offense of aggravated murder, and there appear to be 12 jury signatures affixed.
She was acquitted.
Now, the jury did convict Skylar of what's called gross abuse of a corpse because she buried her baby in the backyard, and the judge sentenced her to 3 years of probation, right? But in the big picture, this is a happy ending, which is not that common.
It's a happy ending, but, she had this hanging over her head for a few years. She wasn't going to college. She was being vilified on social media.
Vilified in social media. That only begins to get the hatred that poured out in social media around the globe against her and her family. I want to add that we asked her lawyers, the ones who got you involved, we asked her lawyers if we could chat with Skylar, if she could join us for this chat. And the main lawyer said, I don't think I'm going to ask her. He said she's so fragile right now emotionally that I just don't think that talking about this case is going to be good for her health.
So it's a happy ending with an awful lot of pain in the meantime. And it's also the exception, not the rule. I hate to admit it, but in the cases I testified in, there are more convictions than acquittals.
Really?
And at least in a few of them, cases where it was very clear to me, at a minimum, that a guilty verdict was implausible, or at least entirely unjustifiable. And in a few cases, pretty clear that the person was innocent.
So Alan, in this case, where the jury found her not guilty, why do you think that was? I mean, how did this develop in a way that convinced the jurors that the confession was false?
That's a great question, and I guess I'd make 2 points of what's different about this case from a typical case. One is the burning, the knowing that she confessed to burning the child, and that was absolutely false. Very possibly opened the jury's eyes. They saw a false confession. What you were saying about how we all think, how could anyone confess something they didn't do? They knew Skylar had done that. So that's number one. And number two is to follow up on what Daniel was saying. Skylar had a pair of excellent attorneys, the Ritkers. Now, all too often in these cases, and criminal cases generally, when we're not dealing with white-collar crime, you have an overworked public defender or court-appointed attorney. Now, I work with a lot of excellent lawyers, but often they lack the resources the Ritkers had. The Ritkers, I believe, were able to have mock jurors respond to the presentation of evidence.
You mean fake jurors who they tested out their arguments on?
Exactly. They had resources. They're excellent lawyers. And again, many public defenders, they do God's work. I work with a lot of excellent attorneys, but most of them don't have the resources that the Ritkers had.
Well, this raises another question because, police officers presumably have a motive to solve the crime. Why would they use techniques that are shown to cause many people, to make false confessions? And by the way, it's to state the obvious, if an innocent person is convicted of the crime, the guilty person is still out on the street.
I think it's safe to say that most of the time law enforcement believes the confessions that they extract. And to a large extent, that's because they are trained to believe that they can figure out whether someone is innocent before they start interrogating them.
So they're like human lie detectors.
Yes, they are taught to observe people during a screening interview. They're not trying to break the person down. They're just trying to figure out, is the person telling the truth?
Now on TV, I've learned if the suspect looks to the left or is it to the right, that shows that they're innocent. If they start jiggling their leg a lot, that shows they're guilty.
Yeah. So the example I always give the jury, if this comes up, is the leading interrogation manual has photos of deceptive and truthful posture. And I will say, juror number 4, I wouldn't believe a word you told me if I subscribed to this methodology because you're slouching. Okay. You get the idea. Now, here's the problem.
It must be fun to watch you testify.
Here's the problem. There are many, many, many studies about humans as lie detectors, as the people observing body language, response to verbal cues, and trying to determine who is being truthful based on that. And they establish unambiguously that humans are poor lie detectors.
Say it ain't so, Alan.
Yeah, believe it or not, that people, trained investigators included, have at best a slightly better than 50% chance of figuring out if someone is telling the truth based on watching them effectively.
I can tell you right now that the 90% of all mothers would say this is nonsense, that they know when they're...
I know, it's counterintuitive. We all think we can, our minds are amazing. But we might as well flip a coin. But the problem is, now law enforcement believes, convinced, based on pseudoscience or their overestimation of their own powers, that if they get a confession from the suspect, it must be true, no matter how it is driven out of them.
There also seems to be a pattern, I've read in some cases, of the police developing a theory of the crime early on, and that theory doesn't get shaken. There's a tendency sometimes among some investigators to filter out contradictory evidence.
Totally.
Or indications that, maybe this is not really the way it all went down. Is that a fair statement too?
Yes, confirmation bias is a huge factor in human life, in human behavior, and in police behavior. Absolutely. And I think there's pressure to clear cases. Now, that doesn't mean that the cops are going to try to get an innocent person to confess, but it means that will influence their perceptions and their thinking. Because, a confession solves the case more often than not. You've done your job. You've cleared the case. So, of course, you have this subconscious motivation for believing it's going to be true.
On the one hand, it gets me upset when I hear about how these police interviewers manipulate people and mislead them and all of that. On the other hand, the fact is there are lots of guilty, horrible people out there, and they lie. And you, as a police investigator, have to use some sort of tough, clever questioning, right?
Right. So a couple of things. One is the problem with the interrogation methods we're talking about are not that they are ineffective. It's that they are too effective. They do break down guilty people. That's absolutely right. The problem is they don't discriminate between the innocent and the guilty. I guess the implicit challenge of your question is, how else would we break down the guilty?
Exactly.
So I get asked that sometimes by prosecutors. Well, how do you recommend people be interrogated? Now, of course, that's not my job to come up with a whole system of interrogation, but I can point to England, where they used to use these more aggressive confrontational styles of interrogation, and now they don't. Let's back up. The first thing I would say is that interrogation should be evidence-based. So, David, when you were confronting those people who were lying, it was because you had the goods on them. You had the evidence. You weren't just pulling someone off the street and grilling them to try to make them give things up to you. And all too often, modern American interrogation practice skips that part. They go right to we're going to try to get the confession before even the interrogation manual I've spoken of says investigate before you interrogate. But in practice, that's often not what happens.
So the police are lazy in a way. I mean, if you want the confession instead of your investigation, instead of gathering actual evidence, it's a shortcut. It's
definitely a shortcut. And you can understand why that's irresistible often, especially to overworked law enforcement departments. But I think there are many ways to get people to acknowledge what they've done, short of lying to them, short of manipulating them. And what they try to do in Great Britain is to establish a rapport. It's to then discuss the case, discuss the evidence, not in this super adversarial way, but it's certainly not problematic to have the suspect look at actual, truthful evidence and say, do you have an explanation for that? And then to identify inconsistencies in the explanation if they emerge. You can do all of that without resorting to the lies, the manipulation, and the stuff which breaks down innocent people.
So, Alan, you mentioned a few minutes ago that sometimes prosecutors say to you, Mr. Hirsch, so what would you do? So what would you do? Like, first of all, what are some efforts across the country to reform this whole system and to finally, after 150 years of court's warning, to finally get police really to, temper how they interrogate people?
By far the most important thing is what we would not do. And that is, we should not use the interrogation practices that produce these false confessions. There are steps being taken in that direction. A few states have adopted laws banning lying to juveniles, for example. And that's a first step. Another step, which is a little amorphous or abstract, but we just all need to be more educated about this. A big part of this problem would go away if simply prosecutors, judges, police, and jurors all learned to look at confessions with suspicion.
You're asking for too much, I think.
Well, probably. Rome wasn't built in a day.
Well, Hollywood could do that, I mean, some police shows could demonstrate this, actually.
That's an interesting idea.
Instead, by and large, police shows show a confession as the final successful result of a police investigation that may, contain some brutality or coercion at least. But then the courts would need to step in, right? I mean, if you want to change the techniques, this is not going to be done voluntarily, obviously. So you need courts also to recognize
and legislatures.
And there have been a number of legislatures which have required videos of the police interrogations.
So this is, of course, a really important reform, which if we were having this discussion 10 or 15 years ago, I'd be saying to you guys, the thing we have to do is videotape all interrogations. And lo and behold, that is happening in, I think, roughly half the states require it, and many more states are utilizing it more frequently. It turns out this is not a panacea. I mean, it is, first of all, it's a bit of a deterrent to police misconduct, that no one's going to hit anyone with the camera rolling. They're still going to use the interrogation methods I've told you about because people still think that's okay.
Well, and they used it in the Skylar Richardson case.
Exactly. And that's why it's not a panacea. I think a lot of us felt if everyone could see what was happening, we'd make major progress immediately. And the reality was that to some extent, seeing is believing. And the juries are still seeing people confess. And even if they're also seeing the tactics that lead to the confession, they tend to believe when someone says, I did it, that they did it.
But also, wouldn't it be necessary to show the entire confession, all 6 hours, let's say? Because if you just take that last final statement of guilt, well, that's very powerful for a jury, I think.
And that is still too often done, is police will record only when the person is ready to confess. So that's the worst of all worlds. The jury sees the confession and they don't see what led up to it. But increasingly, the states that require videotaping typically require that the full interrogation be recorded.
So give us a reason to feel a little uplift as a result of this discussion instead of feeling depressed again, because I'm getting depressed again.
No. I actually think the arc is bending towards justice, just slowly. But I think you do find more juries are acquitting. You do find more judges are suppressing confessions. You do find more legislatures are requiring videotaping, are banning the mistreatment of juveniles at least. So I think it's absolutely things are moving in the right direction, just too slowly.
Well, there's one remedy. It's not really a remedy, but one outcome of some of these wrongful convictions can be financial settlements, financial victories for the defendants. And you were just involved in one fairly recently, which won a big, big amount of money.
Top of the hour tonight, it is a story that you saw first on WGRZ.com, what is believed to be the largest wrongful conviction settlement in the entire state and possibly the nation. It was awarded to the estate of a Buffalo man.
A jury awarded the estate of Darrell Boyd $80 million.
Darrell Boyd was one of what would be known as the Buffalo Five teens wrongfully convicted of a...
So the Buffalo Five were actually somewhat similar to the Central Park jogger case, except that it takes place some 20 years earlier.
In the 1970s.
Yes. Once again, you get the usual suspects rounded up after a horrible crime. They happen to be young and African American. Long story short, they are vindicated some after serving long sentences, and they sue for compensation. And the jury in Rochester had just in the second of these cases that went to trial awarded actually the estate of the poor guy, because he passed away shortly before the trial, but $80 million.
Wow.
Which gives you an idea of how the jury viewed the wrongdoing in question.
Were you involved at all in this case?
Yeah, I testified in that case.
And Alan, after all the time you've spent testifying in these cases and consulting, how many convicts have you helped free from prison, convicts who wrongly confessed? And how many defendants who were maybe about to go to prison have you helped keep out of prison?
That's complicated, and I don't keep the numbers. It's not like I have a one-loss record posted somewhere. But I can say there are different ways that I can help people. A few people, a handful, like Skylar, were acquitted with the help of my testimony. There are these civil cases like the ones we just described where I'm helping someone who has already left prison, but I'm helping them achieve a degree of justice, compensation after the fact. Any number of cases I've been involved in where the judge suppressed the confession, where I testified at a suppression hearing, so the confession was not admitted into evidence and the person was not tried. So I've helped people that way. There are two cases in particular where I flew in one case to Idaho and another to Alaska, where as soon as I got off the plane, I was told by the defense lawyer that precisely because I was coming, the prosecutor offered a deal that was too good to turn down. In Idaho, no prison time at all for someone who faced up to 50 years. So there are a lot of ways in which my involvement can help produce a positive outcome.
Well, it's really interesting that a prosecutor might see your arrival as threatening the case. I mean, that tells you that, I guess, that they don't think they have much of a case without the confession.
I do think it is really upsetting the lengths they go to keep me and the other confessions experts from testifying. They really don't want the jury to be educated in false confessions. And that, to me, is pretty damning. I can't put a number on it, but I'd like to think that, a half dozen to a dozen people a year are benefiting in some non-trivial way from my work. But I also have to tell you, there are plenty who aren't benefiting. I'm doing everything I can, and they are still ending up going to prison, in many cases for crimes they did not commit.
Alan Hirsch is one of the country's leading specialists on false confessions. He has testified in scores of trials. Alan, it's an incredible topic and shocking, really. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you both so much for having me.
Keep up the good work.
Right back at you.
And that's it for this episode of Two Reporters.
You'll find us on Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, or pretty much any leading podcast site. And we hope you'll check out more of our work at tworeporters.org. I'm David Tripler.
And I'm Daniel Zwerdling. Please join us again soon for another episode of Two Reporters. Bye-bye.